Okay, here we go with another tutorial. I wanted to show you guys an app that I built yesterday after I ran into an issue with a Mac that I was re-imaging. Um, there's some things with that I haven't shown you, but this application's got several handlers in it, um, and I'll go through each one, what they actually do, and how they're tied to the interface. The interface is a lot cleaner. It's more of what I like to see than what I've shown you in the past. I was just kind of giving you some of the basics. Um, there's a shell script in here. There's some AppleScript in here. There's actually some code when the application starts up. And I'll explain what that actually does. Turns out to be very handy sometimes if you want to include files or documents within the application and you want to be able to open them. This is a way to do that. But I'll go through, as we go through this tutorial, I'll explain how that actually works. So the AppleScript itself is quite a bit more complicated, but this basically sets an internal path to an object which I had placed inside of my resources folder. So to be able to point to that, regardless of where the app lives, whether it's in your applications folder or whatnot, this pointer takes care of that. So that's the path to that's the actual file name, and then the other resources combined with that. And I've got a couple of properties set, and these properties are they're complicated, and the syntax has to be exact. These are included in two shell scripts that I've written to change some of the system defaults, but in order to do that, I don't want to have to type those in and make a typo, so I've stored them. So all of my buttons I've changed. They're actually images. That's an easy process to do. You just make it a square button. You take the border off, and you basically assign an image to that. So the image file is something that you would add to your application before you build the button, but I just created an icon of a Mac hard drive in Photoshop. Just called it drive, saved it out as a PNG file, dropped it in my resources folder, and now I can use that when I define a button. So normally a button, when you drop a button in, it's a default looking button. But you can change the properties after the fact. You don't have to build these as you go. You can change that button type to whatever you want. So, I changed it to a square because I want that image to be a square. I took the border off, applied the from the image list. I applied the icon. You have to take the text out because you don't want the text displayed. And then the other thing that you can resize the button itself, the clickable portion of the button, however you want. And I'll take the border off. So then I'll resize that so that it includes just the icon. So anytime you click on the image, it performs one of your handlers. So once you tie that to a handler, it's just like a normal button. So, and I like to do that. I don't really like the plain Apple default buttons because most of the apps that I write are utilities with AppleScript code behind them. So I like to customize the buttons. There's another thing going on here that I'll show you a little bit later on in the video. But as you can see, all of my text has been formatted beyond the defaults, except for the disk utility and the vol folder. Change the color, change the size, made them bold. I didn't change the fonts. I'm not a big fan of custom fonts. Most of them are hard to read. The default fonts that Apple uses the system fonts are very legible, easy to read. So just changing the color, making them bold, depending on the background that you're using is is enough, really. I think if you designed an interface that was more like a packaged app, you might use some custom fonts, but even the text labels, I've made them bold. This one is plain. This one is default. This one I just made white and made it bigger. So I've sectioned some of these things off, and I'll show you how to do that. But all the app delegates are very similar to what we did in some of the previous tutorials. You know, the application delegate is predefined. The file owner for the reference object of the window is predefined, and the actions, which, you know, I point to those as AppleScript handlers because this is an AppleScript, you know, so I'll call the outlets actually handlers, even though it's an outlet for the button to the Objective-C handler. I'll just reference it as handler. So that might get confusing when you're looking at the interface, but these are actually actions, and each one of those actions is tied to a handler. Another thing that I did is I created a custom task menu. I got rid of all the edit, view, window, the default menus, and I attached, I bound all of those tasks with custom shortcut keys to the application handlers. So let's see, and the handler names are, like I said, they're like variables. They could be named anything, but I try to name them something. So the first one that I'm going to focus on is just to tell the application disk utility to open. So I just want to, even though you can open it from the dock, you can open it from the applications folder, utilities folder. I just wanted to be able to have in this interface, I wanted to be able to click that and launch disk utility, because that's what I was using. Disk utility has a hidden debug menu that allows you access to the recovery partition, which every Mac has. It's hidden to most users, but if you need to get to that, you have to turn that debug menu on and off, or on. So as you can see, I turned it off, it's missing. Turn it on, it's there. So the debug menu in disk utility is handy for a system administrator. So I just included that section with the debug on and off in my application. So the debug mode basically tells the application disk utility to quit, because disk utility can't be running when you change the preferences. So basically I'm just forcing it, if it's running, telling it shut down. And then what I'm doing is I'm telling the application terminal, which is similar to a DOS command prompt in a Windows machine, but it allows you access to Unix commands. And then I'm basically telling the terminal to set a window, can be called anything, to do a shell script. And then the shell script is just setting the defaults, and it's writing the defaults to a system preference for disk utility, and it's enabling the debug mode, which sets that value to 1. So 1 is on, 0 is off. So basically I'm saying quit the disk utility, enable the debug mode, and then restart the disk utility. So the same thing is happening in reverse on the disable. So I'm killing the disk utility, tell application disk utility to quit, and then I'm telling the application terminal to do a shell script and setting the defaults of the preference file for disk utility, and I'm using the debug enable value of 0, which turns that off. And if you want to know how to set some of the defaults, those are search. Google's great. You can find that. We could go through this for days and days and days. for me getting, and I'll get into some shell scripts later on, but right now I'm not really gonna get into the details of the shell scripts and the how the terminal works, but basically I'm killing disk utility, setting the preferences, and relaunching disk utility. So that allows me to turn that on and off with the click of a button. So this is letting me create a disk partition. So if the recovery partition that comes as a default, which is hidden normally on your hard drive, is missing, you'll see it there in the top section for the internal drive. That recovery partition, based on the environment that I work in most of the time, gets removed when the drives are partitioned, and we have to rebuild that. So this utility from Apple lets you run and rebuild the disk utility. So this is actually an application from Apple, and I just wanted to be able to run it from within my app. So I included the disk utility creation package in my app, and I associated that with a button. And I put a display dialog in there just in case I accidentally click the button. I don't want the package to run, the installer to run. But it basically displays the dialog, and if you answer yes, then what it does is it sets the package to the path to that file, which is in the resources folder. So it combines the path to resource, which is defined when the application starts up, and the file name of the package. So the package is defined as the path to resource, which is that folder, and the file name of the path to resource folder is defined here. That's a complex piece of code. I didn't write that basically myself. I stole that from a Google search that I found. So Google's awesome. There are some useful resources out there. I'm not saying that you can't find the answers to some of your questions, but they have to be quite specific. So basically I'm pointing to that resource folder, and then I'm naming the file, and that's the file name. So that's the installer package, and it's just like any other Mac installer. So once I define it, then I set the package to an alias that the Finder can access. And that POSIX, which is plain old system interface acronym, and it basically turns that Unix path into a Macintosh alias, which is basically what you would double click in the Finder, and then I tell the Finder to open that package. So I have to build the path so that the Finder knows how to access it, and then I just say tell the Finder open this package. And once that's defined and the Finder knows what that string is, it will be able to open that package, just like you double clicking on it from anywhere else. And all of that is attached to a single button, which there I've called Create OS 1010 Recovery Partition. It would get more complicated if I was doing a 1011 partition or a 10.9 partition, or because that's a different installer, so I had to include multiples of those. So this handler here basically opens up a hidden folder on the system, which is where alias is to mapped. We call it mapped because that's the acronym that most PCs users know, but it's actually a mounted volume. So any mounted volume is going to show up in a hidden folder. And this is helpful for our system administrator if you're having trouble with a volume. Sometimes they don't dismount correctly, and you'll have some residual aliases in that folder. So this is just a quick way to click a button and go to folder. So normally you can do it from the Finder. Go to folder, you put in the file path, you hit OK, and it's going to open that folder in the Finder. So the file path is actually the Unix syntax of the file path, and when I click go, it's going to open that. Well, you can't really do that in AppleScript easily. So what you have to do is you have to use system events. So what system events do, they allow you to emulate keystrokes and those kind of things. So I'm telling the application finder to activate. I'm putting in a slight delay there because it's really fast in Xcode. And then I'm telling the application system events to do a keystroke of G using the shift down and the command down. So it's command shift G is the shortcut for go to folder or open folder. And then I'm actually telling it to keystroke the path name that I want to open. And then I'm telling it to keystroke the value enter. So it presses the enter key for me without me having to touch it. So that's that. Okay, so you notice when I move that debug menu, that black box around, all the objects within it moved around. So that's basically a box object. And when you drag a box object into your interface, it's a container that allows you to put other objects inside of it, and it groups them all together, so they stay grouped. So we'll create a new box. In the defaults, the box has a title. It's called box. You can get rid of that. You can name it anything you want. Most of the time, I don't need a name, but you can name the box if you wanted to for reference. But I normally don't need the name, so I set it to none. There's some other properties that you can set. You can change the color, blah, blah, blah. But if you watch and I change the color, it does nothing. And the reason that it does nothing is because it is the box type. So the box type has to be set to custom for it to accept some of those changes that you're wanting to make. So you can turn the frame off. You can do all kinds of things. You can set a custom frame. A green frame with the yellow box, whatever. But those changes don't take effect until you can change it all you want, but until you change it from a primary text box to a custom text box, it doesn't inherit those values. So those values are inherited from a custom attribute and not a system attribute of whatever the defaults are. So boxes are really handy if you're going to group objects together, and you don't want to have to move menus and text objects and buttons or not menus, but text fields and all kinds of things. If you build a bunch of complicated elements on your interface and you want to be able to move them around as a group, putting them in a box is very handy. So you can drag anything you want into that box, and a lot of these things we haven't really covered as far as what they are and what they do, but we will get into some more of those advanced objects and how to tie those to AppleScript. Like here's a little help icon, and you can tie, that's a button. You can tie it to anything. You can have it open a text document that you've created. There's a round button. It's just a button. It acts just like a button. Label, you know what a text label is. Here's a field, text field. Another one that's really handy is the date picker. It doesn't really work that well with AppleScript. It doesn't work as well as the date picker would in a native app, but it works. So it just takes a little bit more work to actually change the date. I don't use the date picker. I get the system date from the OS. So this one is really cool, and I've used it on a lot of different applications. This pop-up button. So you can set values in this list, and then those get assigned. I can never spell chocolate for some reason. Those get assigned to whatever value is bound to that delegate. So if you wanted to say, I like chocolate, I like vanilla, I like, strawberry, whatever. And then you can set, you can remove values. Well, there's a couple ways of doing that. It gets kind of complicated, but if you want a null value coming in, you don't want to remove it from the list. You want the list to stay intact, but I just removed it and I'm not going to add it back yet. So anyway, that's a box. And all the objects, as you move it around the interface builder on your main window, sorry, I'm belching, I'm having a glass of wine, they all stay together. So it's a really useful way to stay organized. Another thing I wanted to show you, let's see, it's not a segmented cell, that's not it, it's a tabbed view. Oh, you notice that some of these things, when I drag them into my interface, it doesn't accept it because they are iOS objects. So you can't use iOS objects in a AppleScript. You can do it, but you have to add some more frameworks, and I'm not going to do it. So a tab view is really cool, and I've used that with a couple of applications. So you can create tabs in your interface, and we'll just create. I'll show you real quick. We'll just create a button here on this tab. We'll call this tab A, and we'll call the second tab B, just for shits and giggles. So we got tab A, we got tab B. So on tab A there's a button. On tab B we're going to add a button. We're going to add it. So if you wanted to segment a lot of different objects in one window, you can create a tabbed view in your application and switch between them. So one of them might be your utility tools, and one of them might be your system preference or your settings. You want to have to go to that separate tab. Oh, I've got this window set to default size because I didn't want to change it, so now it's defaulting back to that. So I want to be able to resize this window. I don't think that's going to do it. There's another setting here. I have to turn off the minimum or maximum size. So I force that window size. Now if I kill this, I got to kill the app. It's already running. So now I can resize it, blah, blah, blah. And you can see in the running application, those buttons aren't tied to anything, so they're not really doing nothing. But you can have it tabbed. All these are clickable. The round button's clickable. The label's the label. The checkbox, you can check it. Text fields you can type into. The date, you can change the date. 1982, I don't know why that's relevant, but it's a default out of the box. So, and then you see my list is missing a value, which I screwed up earlier, but I'll show you how to fix that. That's dangerous if you're not careful. So you have to set those values. But so in that drop down box, so I'm going to have to put that value back in there because I took it out earlier. Again, can't spell chocolate. Don't know why. So you can set what is the default value, and somehow I got an extra key in there. But when you run the app and you don't want that populated, that's basically what you need to do. Is you need to make sure that it doesn't show anything when you do the build. And then when you click on it, you'll have those three options available. So pull down menus are really cool if you wanted to say, so I don't know. It depends on what kind of app you're wanting to build, but you could have drop downs that say run this on. I want this script to settings that say I want this script to run on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, and that could be a value that you could set in the drop down. You could pick one of those 3 days. You can have as many items in the drop down as you want, but So there's a lot of different objects, and they all get tied back to the AppleScript handlers, just like any button would. So some of the earlier tutorials that explain, how to tie an AppleScript. Oh, and there's my menus. So I created those custom menus here, and as you can see, they've got special key strokes, Command Shift D, Command O, Option. I can't see. My eyes are terrible. I'm getting old. But anyway, oh, it's not going to show you when I click the launch handlers, but I can basically do just like I would a regular button. That's not going to show me either. I can control click and drag to the app delegate and tie that to any of the existing handlers. So if I want a menu to perform a function just like a button click would and assign a shortcut key, I don't need the button. You don't even really need the interface. You could do it all from menus, just shortcuts. Command Shift D is going to launch disk utility. So creating custom menus in a app is something that I like to do, but I don't know that any of my users really care or would ever learn the shortcuts. They've learned Finder shortcuts, they've learned Photoshop shortcuts, they've learned all the shortcuts they need for Illustrator and the apps that they use, but they don't necessarily are going to take the time to learn, these utility shortcuts. So we'll get back rid of all that crap that I created, and I've got to set the properties of my window back. Otherwise, it's going to open up as a giant window with a bunch of empty space on it. Let's see. Yes, I need to set it to. I don't want to resize this window. There's no reason to resize that window at all. And let's see, what have I done? It's still big. Oh, I know. So it's still sizable. I'm going to kill this. And oh, there's a box that I dropped in there earlier that we never actually used. So I have to basically set this to, I don't want it to resize. Oh, I have to set the constraints. So I have to set the maximum size on the window. So you can position it as a starting point, like when the app opens where you want it, but I set the max size to the size it is now when I run it. That's the size of the window. This takes a little while to run or open just because it's got some code that runs when it launches. But so that opens disk utility, handy dandy. That opens the volumes folder, which is hidden from most users. This turns the debug menu on in disk utility. This turns the debug menu off in disk utility. And this launches an installer, which is nested inside of my app. Nesting files inside the app. Oh, I've also got a custom icon, which we have not covered. That's in this image assets. There's some strict guidelines on application icons because you have an app icon in the Finder and it's resizable, and you have one when it's running in the dock and it's resizable. So you have to have a variety of sizes of icons, and there's a way to do that with a utility that I have. You can do it manually if you know how to use Photoshop, but it's tough. I mean, it's a pain in the ass, really. But with this little utility that I found in the App Store for free, as long as you have a PNG file, you can create all of your image assets in one fell swoop. It's awesome. So that's basically my tutorial. If you got any questions, I know that was a lot. It was real quick, but if you got any questions, let me know. If you don't care, you can tell me that too, and I can go on to doing something else. So that's all, folks. It's me, Kev. I'll I'll work on another tutorial later. See ya.